Hi, welcome to the Tree.Church Bible Study Podcast. I'm Kelsey Bull. I'm the Associate Director of Young Adult Ministry here at the Tree, and we're so excited you've joined us for this conversation on 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Today, I'm joined by Anthony Lombardi. Sorry, your name is a mouthful, but I don't know if I've ever stuttered over it the way I just did. Anthony Lombardi.
There you go.
He is our campus pastor, and Michael Giacomoni, Executive Director of Experience.
You got a couple hard names here.
Yeah, those are like super ethnic sounding names.
Yeah. A couple of Italian
Do I
guys.
emphasize the wrong thing?
How'd you say it?
Giacomoni?
You're fine.
Okay.
I don't know that
You didn't like that.
everyone in my whole family says it differently. I say Giacomoni.
Oh, okay.
My grandfather does not say it that way.
How does he say it?
He said like Giacomoni.
Oh, okay.
Like it's like he emphasizes everything that he can. It's like everything is the emphasis. He's really passionate about it. Yeah. There's no right or wrong way. You're fine.
Great. And I'd love to give a shout out to our producer, Alex. He's
My
the
man.
best. We appreciate him so much. Today, like I already said, we'll be in 2 Corinthians 10, where Paul is starting to close out this letter. It's the beginning of really the last 4 chapters in this book, and we'll be talking on authority. But before we dive into that heavy topic, I'm a fan of reality TV shows, and I would love to know.
I heard Matthew dunking on you about this a couple days ago.
Yeah.
So yes, a little bit. He did. But what's funny is I leave our office at 4:30 because I pick up our kids, and I kind of started this big conversation. I stirred the pot, and then I ducked out. And Anthony's laughing because he's sitting
I
there.
heard Matt going on a tirade about reality
Oh, yeah.
TV.
Yeah,
So I'm
he
like,
was, he was
And I was
passionate.
gone.
I know that
God.
Kelsey
He was
must have
passionate.
started this, and then you walk out just laughing.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
did.
just
was like,
chucked a grenade
"Jeez,
and
dude."
left.
Yeah, I did. So I really want to know from both of you, if you could be in any reality TV show, what would it be and why?
Oh man, probably. I don't know. Probably Survivor.
Okay.
I don't like the puzzles. I don't know. I haven't seen Survivor in so long, but the puzzles
Sure.
always would make me anxious. But I like the social element. You got to kind of be slick
yeah.
about it. The strategy side, where you're like, all right, you can't vote out the good people too quick, but you also can't keep them there too long. It's like a puzzle. It's like a mental puzzle, which I think is a little more interesting to me. So I'd probably say Survivor.
Okay.
I also have to look at it. If I looked at a list of all reality shows, I might find
Yes.
one I might be more inclined to.
Sure.
I think the Jersey Shore would be wild just to watch them be
Oh, my
insane.
gosh.
Just
Yeah.
to be like, just experience humans like that. Like, this is how we live your life. This isn't, to be a fly on the wall, not to be in the show, but just to be like.
I was gonna say, yeah, that would be tough to actually be in the show.
No, I wouldn't want to be in the show unless it was like me trying to wrangle them up. I think that'd be to have one responsible person trying to like. I think that's the funnier show. Like,
Oh,
just
man.
put one mom in there, like try to keep them all together.
Anthony?
So I joked about this, but Fear Factor. Were you in there when I said Fear Factor?
No, I was not.
So like I was
but
first of all, I
okay.
was like, this is considered a reality show, right?
Yeah.
Like to some degree, maybe not by certain definitions, but like most today, I'm like, number one, I'm a married man, so that eliminates
Half of
me
them
from
are
most of
out.
those.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Not that I would want to be on them anyway, because I think most of them are just full of drama and
Sure.
garbage, but we won't go there. We won't start
That's
that
okay.
conversation. No, Fear Factor, because there's not, like, I'm not afraid of snakes, spiders, bugs. If you've seen any of my Instagram or Facebook posts, my kids are also the same way, like me, in that they're not afraid of any of that stuff.
Wild.
Not really afraid of heights. So, like, I would like the competition element.
I'm terrified
and,
of both of those things.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
so I think it would be fun.
Okay, but is there a difference between you not being afraid of that stuff and being in a bath of tarantulas? You know what I mean? I feel like
I honestly don't. Like, I just don't think it would bother me
just,
that
like,
much. I'm not saying like
compartmentalize
I'm not
it. You wouldn't
something
like it.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's something that like, oh man, that would
makes
be
sense.
really fun. But I don't
I'd
think it would like
terrified.
really bother me.
Yes.
I don't think I could do it.
No, I could not either. Mine would be Keeping Up with the Kardashians, partly because my name starts with K, so I fit in.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But also, I have watched that show from the beginning,
Oh, my
and I love
goodness.
them, and I think it would be
Do you feel
hilarious.
like you're connected to them? Do you feel like there's like a kinship there?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, I get that. I get that with fictional characters. Like,
Yeah.
like
Yes.
a good sitcom, I feel like by the end they're my friends.
100%,
I know they're
man.
not.
Yes.
In my head, they're my
Yeah,
friends.
you know them
Yes.
well. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I love to read books. That's why I love to watch TV shows or movies. I get invested in characters.
Oh, that's
and
sure. Yeah,
for
me
sure.
too.
I feel like for some of these reality TV shows,
You're in it.
Yeah, I'm in it. I was in it from the beginning. But also this question made me think of The Real World from MTV.
Yeah, I remember.
And a little bit of
I almost said that one. Yeah.
Yes, a little bit of your Jersey Shore reasoning. Like, I just want to see how I would do in this house of chaos with so many different characters.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I missed that one.
Yeah.
Okay, second question. What is a skill or ability that you already possess that you feel like you are really confident in?
So I was thinking about this, and I'll say cutting hair. So I've cut my hair for a long time. I've cut quite a few. Yeah, I've cut. Well, that one would be the really confident one. Okay. The other ones would be semi-confident. But I've cut my brother's hair for probably like 10 years now.
Nice.
I've had a ton of friends. Like during COVID, I had a bunch of people like contact me, and they're like, "Yeah, like I can't go to the barber. Can you cut my hair?" So, and I would say like I was confident in all of those, but not really confident. Although I would say I'm really confident cutting my own hair.
Okay.
So. Do you still cut your own hair? Mm-hmm. No way.
Yeah.
You have really. I almost asked you like, hey, where do you go? You cut your own hair right now?
Yeah. Yeah.
No way. You do a very good job. That's
Thanks.
impressive.
Appreciate it.
So I'll say the same thing. So when I was in college. What is that face?
I'm kind of surprised.
What's that? There are like 3 people who work here that I cut their hair on a monthly basis.
That's amazing.
I promise, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
No,
That's awesome.
I did know that.
Sure.
But I don't.
You're just surprised I'm going to say the same thing.
Yes.
Sure. Well, I just think because we're talking about it. So in college, I was broke, and it was right when having like cool hair was cool again. Where when I was more of a teenager, you just wanted to look unkempt and kind of like. But it's right when like kind of Anthony's haircut, like fading up the sides, like pushing it over. And I wanted to have that so bad, but I was broke, so I couldn't afford to like go get it cut. So I just ruined my hair for like 6 months straight, trying to learn how to do it, until I finally figured it out. And then it opened up. Then all of a sudden, you're that guy. For hey, can you other broke college people?
Yeah.
And now to this day, it's like Elijah Reed. We were talking a couple of days ago, where I get a text from him like every 2 weeks, like, "Hey man, it's
that's
about
so
that time."
funny, man.
Yeah, I always try to get him to mow my lawn or something for it. And
What are the chances that both of us sit down and talk about that?
Yeah, well, that's what we think. Like,
I didn't even know it. We didn't know it about either one of each other.
But cutting your own hair, so I do mine often, but I've had to really teach Gina, my wife, how to help me with the back. That's where I get messed up.
That's what everybody asks me when they find out I cut my own hair.
Tough.
They're like, "How do you do the back?" And I'm like,
do
honestly, I just do the mirror, and I'm used to it.
Yeah, I've done it. I just more at this point, and you can do it by feel too, if you know like where your skull drops down and kind of. But it helps when you got your wife to help out.
I kind of feel like that is a wild skill to have, because I do feel like men's hair specifically is having like such a moment and has been, and it matters a lot.
I'm waiting for it to drop
some
off,
people.
and I feel like it hasn't. It's that's still a thing. Where like so when I grew up, it was almost cool to be like, I don't care,
Yeah.
And now it's not the case.
No, it's not. It's not.
I mean, I guess for some people it is, and that's if you're confident, you can pull it off. I'm sure you can pull anything off if you're confident enough about it.
Yeah, that is true, and I feel like that confidence is key. And maybe we'll come back to that topic here later in our conversation.
Sure, is that what leads into the discussion?
Yeah, and so going back into 2 Corinthians, Paul has been addressing a lot of crucial topics with the Church of Corinth, and he has really, I feel like, in a lot of ways, addressing a tension that he feels. And today's conversation, I don't think, is much different. It's a little bit more centered around the topic of authority. And so we're going to dive into 2 Corinthians 10, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 6, and we'll kick off our conversation. It says this: "Now I, Paul, appeal to you with the gentleness and kindness of Christ, though I realize you think I am timid in person and bold only when I write from far away. Well, I am begging you now so that when I come, I won't have to be bold with those who think we act from human motives. We are human, but we don't wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. And after you have become fully obedient, we will punish everyone who remains disobedient." Anthony, to start us off, what is the tension or conflict Paul is describing here?
Well, you kind of see bits and pieces of this throughout really 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that there's some leaders, some people who are, claiming the authority of apostleship. And they are, they're throwing their weight around. They're using their authority in a way that in many ways is contrary to what Paul is doing and what he's teaching. So not only I think what he's teaching, but also the way that he sees and views authority. is radically different, which he kind of hints at here. So yeah, there's really there's this division going on where they're dealing with people that are there physically in proximity to them, where Paul is far off, right? He's the one who's, throughout his missionary journeys started churches. He's overseeing the churches. But right now there's this tension between himself and these other leaders who really in a lot of ways don't think too highly of Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's great. I mean, it's just like, even the way that Paul opens that, like, I realize that you think I'm this, and you see this boldness when I write from far away. Yeah, I just think Anthony said it really well. Like, him addressing that tension, I think is super important for, what comes next for the whole context of the passage.
Yeah, for sure. How do we today kind of handle this idea when other people assume we have self-serving motives, right? Like, we see the tension is these, maybe we could call them false apostles in this conversation, I think have this self-serving attitude. And I think Paul is pointing that out, that his is not that. But I think that's a conflict we see today, specifically sometimes in Christian leadership, right? Michael, so how do you feel like, what advice would you maybe give us on how we handle that when other people assume that we have self-serving motives?
Yeah. Have you guys ever heard of the term virtue signaling? Mm-hmm. I feel like it became really popular throughout like 2020. Everything's really divisive, and I feel like I learned like 30 new terms about, like gaslighting, virtue signaling, all this, critical theory, all these new things I didn't really know, but honestly, age-old things that we know have existed forever, but it's kind of a newness in the way that we talked about it, but or a frequency. But with virtue signaling, a lot of times people view it when they're weaponizing that term as a way to say, really accuse your motives and say, oh, you're only saying that you care about this because you want to appear this. Mm-hmm. And so you're just like, you'll weaponize it the other way. Yeah, but you're only saying that because you want to appear this way, and you're just trying to be pandering is usually, I think, maybe the better word that people are looking for about virtue signaling is you're pandering to an audience, you're trying to lobby for something like that. But I think the reality of that term is that's how humans operate. Anytime we talk, we are signaling what we care about, our virtues. Like, what do you value? What do you think about? And I think it's a mistake almost any time to look at somebody and assume that they are being dishonest in that process. And that's really hard in my life because I'll have a ton of conversations with people where I'm just such a, I assume the worst often. So when I hear somebody talking, it's easy for me to go down this path of like their motives are wrong, their motives are incorrect, they're up to no good, but the moment that I know that I start with that framework, I'm now intellectually not even able to have an honest conversation with them, where I've realized if I assume the best, it makes people feel more cared for, it makes people feel safe, and that oftentimes leads to a genuine argument. And even if they really were being false in the beginning and had a bad motive, to give them the benefit of the doubt and to continue in an honest conversation, usually true motives come up organically. So I think anybody, whether you're on the receiving end of it or you're doing it to somebody or that people are assuming the worst of you, give each other the benefit of the doubt, and then organically, if you do that long enough, trust that the Holy Spirit and where the conversation organically goes, that those things, and I think we see that here in this case too, where it's like over time, what are we reading right now? Paul's works, no one else's. Because over time, what is genuine, what is authentic will come to light.
Yeah, that's a great point. Anthony, would you add anything to
that?
that?
I mean, I think the other side of it is, what do you do when you're the leader who people are assuming, things about? Like, how do you handle that? And I mean, there's some practical questions in there. Number one, how do you discover that? Like if somebody's talking about it, so-and-so said this. Yeah. I think, you would like to think in an ideal world, particularly in the church, that people are able to come to you when they have an issue, right? Yeah. That's not always the case. So I think there's that burden to have to do that especially as a spiritual leader in a church, where if I were to hear somebody, saying that about so-and-so said this about you, like I would want to make things right. I would want to have a conversation with them. Mm-hmm. So I think even having, number one, not starting with a posture of defensiveness, because you don't know what information they're getting or what they're basing this off of, or maybe it was just a misunderstanding at the beginning. So whatever they're starting with, maybe that was a misunderstanding. So I think having an approachable attitude, not coming off as super defensive. I think one of the things you see today in many churches is that Christian leaders come off as unapproachable. Or untouchable in a lot of ways. I think that exasperates the problem. Mm-hmm. So I think being a flesh and blood human being that is able to connect with people, relate with people, even of a church of this size, right, a big church, to be able to come to someone and say like, hey, I heard this, would love to have a conversation with you, would love to hear some of the things that are bothering you or that are concerning to you. So even having that posture of humility and being willing to listen to people, I think they're just simple things that are very disarming. and opens up a bridge of conversation rather than closing off those, the ability to have those conversations and people just to assume the worst and then move on.
100%. I totally agree. And I think even Paul gives us like a great way to do that. He says we use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons. Mm-hmm. So my worldly weapons would immediately be like vindictiveness, revenge. Like, oh, you think that about me? Oh, I can't wait to embarrass you and tell you how wrong you are.
Yeah.
That would be like my impulse as a person. But when I think about mighty weapons, I think about things like spiritual fruit, kindness and gentleness and self-control and patience and love. And the trick of it is you can still be very direct in truth. You can still say, that is not true.
Yeah.
That is not how you might assume this. You might think this. You've heard this. But you can still be super direct, but you can still be kind and you can still be patient. You can still exercise all those things. And that to me is immediately disarming to people. And it also informs you quickly of where the conversation is even capable. Because if you do use those spiritual weapons, if you do act of spiritual fruit and someone is still just like, doesn't matter, truth doesn't matter, I don't care how you deliver it, then you can almost realize, compartmentalize it of this is not going to be worth the time and energy. You're going to think what you think and I'm going to love you anyways, but peace out. Like I'm not going to, back off of it.
Yeah. I think too, even scripture speaks about that, right? When people malign you, like make sure that you're demonstrating good work so that when they do that, like they're put to shame because they can say all this stuff, but then you demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit. Yeah. It's going to be really hard to actually get any traction slandering a person when you're demonstrating a posture of humility, listening, being willing to go to them, even if you're not the one who initially had the problem, which even biblically speaking, they're the ones that should be coming to you. So I think even doing that is not only disarming, but if it doesn't work, at the very least, like your
character's intact.
Absolutely. Your character's intact. Your conscience is clear because of the way that you handled it. But I do think, there's absolutely a difference when you look at how Paul is doing things versus the people that he's addressing, the leaders in the church. There's a massive distinction. And of course, Paul is imitating Jesus. So when we talk about Paul's giving us a great model, well, Paul is imitating Jesus. Yeah. And I love your point about even, you can speak the truth. You can be firm.
Or even in Paul's case, you can even be frustrated. Paul says that endlessly.
Absolutely.
But it's from this place of care and spiritual fruit in his life, not from anger or resentment.
Yeah. And I think in our society, so often we've talked about this a lot in the office, like so many of the problems that we see in society and even in the church are just the extremes, right? You move to one side of the spectrum or the other. But the reality is you can speak the truth. You can be firm. You can have hard conversations. It doesn't mean you have to be a jerk about it. Right. You can be gracious. You can assume the best, as you said. Yeah. You can ask questions. I think even that is a practice, asking questions, right? I think so often we're ready to talk over people. I know I've been guilty of this so many times where you're literally listening to someone, not to hear them, not to understand them. Yeah. You're just waiting for them to stop so that you can start speaking. And I feel like even that posture of, I really genuinely want to hear you. I'm trying to understand. So asking clarifying questions. Those are drastically different things, especially in the context of this conversation coming with the weight of authority and power. Yeah. Like in our society, the CEO of the company doesn't do that, right? Like that's the mindset. They don't do that. They would never come to a so-called lowly employee and have a conversation. Hey, I heard you're having this problem. That is not the norm. So I think even that whole conversation of the distinction between power dynamics and authority, what that looks like in the church versus what we see actually in the world. Yeah,
and I don't want to belabor the point, but there's something that you said that has genuinely been life-changing for me, where I spent most of my life doing exactly what Anthony said, waiting for that opportunity to speak up. Like the moment that somebody starts, I already have a formed thought. I'm ready. And I'm just not even listening at that point. I'm not honoring them. When I was a kid, I had like a terrible stutter until I was like 14. Like I could like barely, because I was just my mind was working quick and my brain or my mouth couldn't keep up. And I just so badly wanted to say what I wanted to say and I just couldn't. With time, I've realized the best way for me to combat that is just asking more questions because it forces you to listen. It makes you have to. And if I'm going to make a quick opinion or the next thing to say, I would rather it be another question for them to continue hearing their heart and then finally make like a formed opinion where they feel heard and honored. And so that's kind of even separate from that. But when you mentioned that, I'm like, that is, I hope people can hear that because that's been, if you're anything like me in that sense, it's been genuinely life-changing. I don't do it great all the time, but it's something I strive for. Yeah.
No, that's great. I feel like a lot of what you guys are saying often starts in our mind, right? In verse 5, I really appreciate the way the NIV reads. It says, we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ.
Yeah, so good.
And that verse has stood out to me for a long, long time because I do think so much begins in our mind. And so what I would ask, and maybe we'll start with you, Anthony, is how do we practically take captive every thought? What does that look like? Because that feels really hard. I don't know what the stat is, but we have to have millions or billions of thoughts run through our mind every day?
Yeah, I mean, it is a tough question. Like, I think the practical element of this is very, very difficult. Even if you can come up with great practices, they're going to be difficult to actually implement into your daily life because of what you just said. Thinking is one of those things that you just do it, right? It's not like
breathing.
you don't think to think in a way. You can, but so much of our thoughts are just reactionary to what's going on around us. But I think even if you laser in on the language of like taking captive, right? The idea that it's terrible to think about, but you think about the concept of slavery or something, or a person, a POW of war, right? This idea of a person who has freedom, who has some level of autonomy, then being taken and restricted so that they are not able to do what they normally would do. So let's apply that to thinking, right? We might have thoughts that are negative or impure or ungodly or destructive. Do we let those thoughts run rampant in our minds? Do we let them go to the next level, right? I mean, we see in Scripture, James talks about this idea concerning temptation and desire, right? It kind of starts there, and then there's this natural progression. So do we actually filter those thoughts? Like, are we actively asking myself, is this something that honors God? Is this something that's honorable to this person? If I say this, what's the the reaction of this person going to be in the midst of this conversation? So I think part of it is there is a real way where we, even to draw out what you were saying, part of it is maybe just we need to slow down. I think particularly as Americans, we are so fast paced in everything that we do. Now, this is even more difficult I would put myself in this category, probably Michael as well. When you're an external processor, it's even more difficult because you're thinking out loud almost all the time. So as you're talking, you're thinking rather than the internal processor who is literally, it takes them a moment to figure out what they want to say. So there's almost a slight benefit to that because it's like I can kind of put this through a few filters before I speak it out loud, where someone like myself or maybe like Michael, you might need to slow down a little bit and really be more thoughtful and intentional with the words you use, and really almost that filter of asking yourself some questions. Again, like, is this true? Is this going to be pleasing to God? Is this going to be edifying? What's the consequences of this if I say that? So I think even just thinking in those terms. Yeah,
100%. Yeah, I think for me, like, the idea of taking every thought captive, I think you can read that and think that, like, that means that if I'm thinking bad things or if my reactionary thought is sinful, then I got to button that up. The reality that I felt in my life is that I can very rarely impact my reactionary thoughts to the world around me, to what I'm seeing. I don't have a lot of control over that because that's how your brain organically operates. Now, something that I do believe is I've recognized in my own life, the more I'm inundated with Scripture and worship and prayer, my reactionary thoughts are generally more positive and holy, but that's still not an absolute. Like, any way you spin it, regardless of how prayered up you are, ready you are with the armor of God, your reactionary thoughts are at times still reactionary thoughts. And for me, one of the ways to combat that is knowing what to do with it when you have it. You can stew on it, and then you can build incorrect assumptions off of it. I could, lead me to sinful places, whether it be of anger or lust or whatever, where I'm going to my head of, I noticed this thing and I'm going to build this whole thing around it, or letting the reactionary thought, not beating yourself up over it, but knowing what to do with it. Recognize, okay, I feel this. That's not how I want to feel. I want to think differently. I want to think better. Offer that up to God, and then try to go through whatever your practices of, like, all right, go to your happy place or just pray. Whatever the thing that's going to now fill that void of where you would normally feel stewing on that thought. So to me, taking it captive isn't not having it. It's what do you do with it when you have it?
That's a great distinction, because I think you're right. I think so much of our thoughts are reactionary, right?
Yeah.
You can't control it in the moment. But it's what do you do with it? And what you were saying even about Scripture and what we meditate on, it's almost like the proactive element can help the reactive element, right? Yeah. What are you doing in the meantime? What are you meditating on? Yeah. What are you watching? What are you soaking up in your in your life? I think even like Romans 12, right? Paul talks about this idea, we're transformed how? Through the renewal of our mind. So I think, what you're meditating on, what you're filling yourself up with, the more that happens as you fill yourself up with the truth of Scripture, through prayer, all of those things, even surrounding yourself. Like, I think of the church staff here, like how incredible this group of people are. The people you surround yourself with, that is over time going to shape how you are even in your reactionary moments. So I think it's a great distinction.
Yeah, we live in a time of, like, dramatic content that we consume by volume. Anthony and I had a conversation yesterday about a show that we both like, that we both acknowledge, like, when we watch too much of that show, I feel bummed. It's a great show. Like both of us said, I think Chris Reed said as well, probably one of the well-made great things of, like, what a great work of art. But if I watch too much of it, I'm just sad, and I know that's going to inform my reactionary thoughts. I know it's going to impact the way that I view people. I'll assume that that there's nefarious things all the time, because that's kind of what that show was built around. And so he's even moderating that. It's not even just as simple as pray more. It's also like, no, what's the other stuff? You could pray all the time, but if you're still
absolutely,
if you're still allowing too much of other stuff in your life that is impacting your output, man, you gotta moderate that as well.
Yeah, that's good. Pastor Brandon, Micah, and I are reading this book called Unhurried Leadership, and there's a chapter in there, I think it might be titled Unhurrying Our Thoughts, and we just read it like a week or two ago, and there's this practice the author lays out where you set a timer, and he says start small, so 5 minutes, and for 5 minutes, you just write down every thought that comes to mind, and then when the timer goes off, you have a list of your thoughts. And it could be a lot, or, depending on your headspace, maybe not. But then the next step is to identify where you feel like this thought came from. Wow. So and is this thought positive, neutral? But it's like it's a legit practice in my opinion, like taking every thought captive and trying to evaluate, is this thought from the enemy? Is this thought neutral? Is this thought godly? Is this thought something someone said to me? And then evaluating like the third phase, and this is my paraphrase of this. The author says it way more eloquently, but the third step is, what am I going to do with these thoughts? Like, am I going to live from a place where I believe this, or am I going to identify this as false and name it that, right, and move on? And I think that in and of itself, thinking about your thoughts, which sounds so
It's tough.
Yeah. I don't know what the word is, but that is like big. It feels big to me, right? Yeah. But thinking about your thoughts and trying to identify where they came from, and also trying to identify what am I going to do with them, I think slows us down.
Sure.
So that we are aware of what we're thinking. Because if we're not, whether we like it or not, whether we're aware of it or not, that is how we live our lives. Like the things in our head is what's going to come out of us, whether it's through our words or our actions. And so I think we really need to be aware of that. Before we go on to the next section, is there anything else from verses 1 through 6 you guys want to touch on?
I feel good about it. I thought that was great.
Yeah, I think what Paul's ultimately saying is a lot of what we're talking about here. The way he views authority, the way that he, is even engaging with them. He's really modeling what we're talking about conceptually. So,
Sure. So let's go on to verses 7 through 11. Look at the obvious facts. Those who say they belong to Christ must recognize that we belong to Christ as much as they do. I may seem to be boasting too much about the authority given to us by the Lord, but our authority builds you up. It doesn't tear you down. So I will not be ashamed of using my authority. I'm not trying to frighten you by my letters, for some say Paul's letters are demanding and forceful, but in person he is weak and his speeches are worthless.
Dang it.
And he knows what they're saying. Yeah. Those people should realize that our actions when we arrive in person will be as forceful as what we say in our letters from far away.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah,
Maybe it's how I read it in my mind, but it is that. Yeah. It is that. In this, I feel like I hear, and again, I'm reading this through my own context, right?
Sure, yeah.
We read scripture through our own experiences and through our knowledge, but I read it as Paul's confidence and passion is growing and igniting. So Michael, where do you feel like Paul's confidence is coming from?
So that's a really good question. I feel like this might be not the super popular answer because it's kind of a tough thing to go through, but it seems to be that it is not news to him, his strengths and weaknesses. Where when he says hey, it feels like he's probably a little insecure about it. It's everyone keeps saying it's about me. You heard it too many times, geez, guys. But it's interesting to me that he doesn't go into this defense of I think I'm great at talking in front of you. What are you talking about? I'm not, small and meek, whatever. He doesn't go that route of self-defense. There seems to be a self-awareness of maybe not the point. Let's get to the point, Yeah. When I do come speak to you, it has the same boldness of this because the truth is the truth. And what I'm delivering is the same regardless of where. Like I said, what it seems like is, there's this case to be made of Paul that he is a very strong author. And I know tons of people like that. I know there's somebody who works for me who is a little bit more stoic in nature. But anytime I get an email or a text about something, it is oh, that's where you shine. Where it's it's more emotive than they even would be in real life. Where understand their heart better because they might be an internal processor. So when people are internally processing, they might look stoic, they might look calm, they might look meek, they might look quiet. But then when you give them time to like actually sit with their thoughts, it's like beautiful and it's poetic and it beautifully communicates what their actual heart is. So that might be the case with Paul, where he's like, no, okay. But rather than him getting defensive and almost in the weeds about, what are you guys talking about? He seems to have this confidence of my strength in communicating to you is not going to be the point of this. It's like that might, it is the fact that they're also not here to frighten you. They're not supposed to be strong-arming you either. My speeches aren't worthless in person because the truth that I'm writing about, the truth that I'm speaking about, regardless of the efficiency of the communication method, the truth is the truth. And I feel like when you are so unapologetically confident, I always thought that about Pastor Matthew, where at first glance, if you were to just see him in his confidence from afar, you might say, oh, you probably think highly of yourself. You might be arrogant. Like you can think that of like a really dynamic, confident lead pastor. And the more I got to know Matthew over the last, 9 or so years, whatever it's been now, is you realize, oh, there's like a deep humility of he's the first person in the room to admit that he's wrong about anything. I've never seen anything like it from a leader perspective. It's very cool. Very rapidly say, oh, I'm wrong. That's a bad idea. That idea is better. Very quick to that. Very quick to apologize. Very quick to move on from something. But he still has this unapologetic confidence. It's like, oh, it's because he's confident in the Holy Spirit. And he'll say that. It's like, I'm confident in the Holy Spirit. I'm confident in how he's burdened my heart. I'm confident that I've also read the word enough that I know that I'm not, and then where I am wrong, you move on. So Paul has this like conviction of confidence because he understands the strengths, understands the weaknesses. He doesn't have enough ego that he needs to get defensive about it. He says, no, like the Spirit of God is leading me. This is the truth. And I think that is a very powerful place to be in.
Yeah. I mean, and just to echo that too, I think there's a misconception going on in this passage, and I think the same is true today. Again, like if you were to ask, any given person on the street, if you were asked 100 people, what type of personality would you expect from a CEO? What type of behavior? What type of actions? How do you think they would carry themselves? I think what's happening here is they have this certain idea of what an apostolic figure is supposed to look like, how they're going to throw their weight around. But Paul's model, again, is Jesus. I mean, think of Jesus. Like the whole entire concept of Jesus being the Messiah threw everybody off because he didn't do what they thought he was going to do. The way that he carried himself as a meek servant. Paul is doing the same thing, and yet he's what we would consider like a mega apostle, right?
Yeah.
That has been literally sanctioned by Jesus Christ himself through a vision, Acts chapter 9, like chosen by God to do this, to be this messenger. And yet he doesn't throw his weight around. He doesn't carry himself in a way that the people are used to seeing from what I would say corrupted secular power.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So would you say there might even be a case where it might not even be that he's not as good in person at teaching? Like that's my read. Okay, it might even just be that they just expected someone who's more haughty or someone who's more like aggressive. Could that be the case where it's just like you're so shocked at his demeanor?
Yeah, I think from the things that I've read, like you look at like Greek culture, for one, humility was not considered a virtue. So like humility in and of itself was actually considered a negative thing.
Wow.
So you think about that, that makes a lot of sense, right? In this is a high Gentile population in Corinth who he's talking to. So their understanding is so corrupted in what they think authority should look like. So when Paul shows up, right, or he writes these letters, like to them, they're like, this guy, he's weak, like he doesn't carry himself. He doesn't carry himself in a way that a leader should carry themselves. That's what I'm saying. If you were to ask a person today, like secular culture, what does someone who's powerful, dynamic, how do they carry themselves? Like the assumption is that they're going to be uber confident in themselves, maybe oftentimes arrogant, not even always likable, but they're going to get the job done. And I think Paul, in this case, he just doesn't fit. Just like Jesus didn't fit.
Jesus probably wouldn't also fit that. They might describe him the same way.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Sure. And I think when we read scripture, or, I don't want to say we, but when I read scripture, sometimes it's so easy for me to picture these people as just that passage that I'm reading. And I forget all of the backstory we know, all of the transformation that they've gone through, all of the suffering that they've experienced, right?
Especially in Paul's case,
Right. Yeah. And so it's interesting, when I was reading this passage in preparation for this conversation, I really feel like in the simplest terms for me, Paul's confidence comes from his faith. Paul's confidence comes from, he has seen God show up for him over and over and over and over and over again. And God has brought him to this place. He's brought him to these people, this relationship in this time for a reason. And he has such confidence in that maybe such faith in that he is confident, that
Yeah,
he is confident in
absolutely.
what he has to say and who God has created him to be. And I think that it's so easy for me to read this passage and forget all of that backstory.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, what's like a cool practice for those of you, something that is a really cool free resource is called the Bible Project. Have you guys ever heard of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Love it.
I love it. I'm not gonna say like the authority on everything, but you know,
Sure.
it's a great free resource on YouTube. But something that I'll do before I teach a message, or a lot of times before I'll do a podcast, I can get to you for this one, but I'll go watch the Bible Project book overview of, let's say we're in Corinthians. Let's watch the book overview of this. They do a really good job, and if they skimp on it, I can go find it elsewhere. You know, the stuff is everywhere. But looking at the timeline, okay, this was written. This is what Paul had already experienced. This is what he hadn't experienced yet.
Sure.
It's just a really easy way when you're reading the Bible for that. If you ever like need that reminder of the weight of what's being said, just to look at that timeline, to figure out where exactly am I at here. Paul is going through this. This is all the context. It's just like just as a resource thing. It's a really. It's literally an 8-minute thing. Those videos usually 8 to 10 minutes that you can do just to give yourself that context. It's a super easy entry point just to try to understand that depth a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, super
100%.
cool.
Yeah, their graphics are incredible.
The graphics are
I
incredible.
watched
So
it in
easy to watch.
preparation for this conversation, and I do think hearing it along with seeing the timeline written out is so helpful.
I'm such a visual learner too, so for me it's always helpful. The way they map out the timelines, it's great.
It is awesome. So talking on Paul's authority, Anthony, where do you feel like his authority is coming from, and how is he using it?
I mean, I think it's what you just said. I think it's the same place this confidence comes from. I mean, I mentioned it, Acts chapter 9. For those watching this that want to check that out, I mean, it's interesting to see, like, literally Paul is handpicked by Jesus to be a vessel to be used for the nations. Like, he just, for whatever reason, God chooses Paul. He says, I'm going to use your life in this way. So his authority literally comes from Jesus. Like, Jesus says, you're going to do this. I've handpicked you to do this. So there's that element where, again, if you think in terms of secular authority and power, like, I mean, what a way or what a reason to boast. Right. Like, man, like Jesus picked me. And yet again, that's not how Paul uses his authority. And I love what he says, because I think verse 8 is so crucial. You know, he says, I may seem to be boasting too much about the authority. Why does he even say that? Because he keeps appealing to it, because he wants them to understand, look, Jesus has sent me to come and preach the good news to you. So for him, it's a chain of command in the sense of, like, my authority is not taken for myself. I'm not saying, hey, listen to me because I'm the best at this or X, Y, Z. It's literally because Jesus has sent me to speak this stuff to you. So his authority is from that. But this idea of boasting, then he goes on and says, but our authority builds you up. So he's not concerned about the authority, because for him, authority is not something that you use to take advantage of people. Authority is something that you use for good. And I think this is where, like, this is such a great case study, because we need to talk about this in our society. Like, power and authority can be used for great things, or it can be used in very, very destructive ways. And we see that most of the time, unfortunately. In our world, in the news, even among churches, sadly, you see this abuse of authority, this abuse of power. It's used for self-serving purposes, which is part of the reason why I think people naturally have a skepticism of leadership, because they assume that there's some sort of underlying, motive where they're trying to get something for themselves. And yet Paul is trying to get them to understand, the reason I'm not ashamed of my authority, the reason I keep referring to my authority, is not because I'm trying to get something from you. It's because I'm trying to do something for you. It's because I'm trying to point you to the good news of Jesus and make sure you're standing in the truth, as opposed to these other leaders who are leading you astray and doing things for their own purposes. So there's this massive contrast. But I just love that he, again, modeling Jesus, right? What does Jesus say? He talks about power and, the lords of the Gentiles, they lord power over them, but not so with you, right? He says that the disciples are going to serve one another, and the one who serves is the greatest. Incredible. So I think Paul, again, we just see him modeling the exact thing that Jesus did and the exact things that Jesus taught.
Do you guys know what Enneagram types you are?
Yes, I'm a 2-wing 1.
You're 2?
Have
you ever taken it?
Yeah, I have a lot of elements of 1, and I also have some elements of 8.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
I'm an 8. What was that face?
I asked you, are you going to share?
I said 8, and you looked like, yeah, I know. Like,
I mean, I do know. We've talked about it.
Okay, gotcha.
And I feel like I know you.
Sure, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I would have guessed that you were a 2. All right, so I don't know much about the Enneagram, but like for me, what I know is a lot of it, my very rough understanding is it's about fear and about safety as well. So as an 8, my fear is feeling out of control, or I love control. If I feel like I'm in control of stuff, there's a safety with that. That means a lot of times people like me get positions of leadership, mostly because it's like the terrifying reality of submitting to something that could like potentially not treat you well, or put you in a position of danger, whether it be financial, mental, spiritual stress, whatever the case might be. Two is like the fear point would be you being what's the word? Obsolete. Like
Yes,
that you
not
have
needed.
no function, not
Yeah.
needed. So I look at things like that. For me, that resonates so much with me to even understand where that authority is meant to be helpful is when you look at the Enneagram, it tells you what the most healthy version of yourself, the least healthy. The most healthy version of an 8 is usually you're magnanimous. It's not that you've neglected the fact that, no, you will inevitably have like some kind of a leadership position if you decide to, but or if you gun for that, if you're capable of it. But when you have that, it's to be magnanimous in it. It's to help people versus the worst case scenario would be like a dictator.
Yep.
You've accumulated much power and you use it and you wield it over people to hurt them. That is, I feel like, a burden that we see often of people in power, where they've accumulated much because they're capable, but they don't wield it with care. They're not magnanimous. You don't know what magnanimous means. It's basically like where you have authority over someone and you're kind to them and you lift them up and you use that authority to make them better. Which is awesome, but it's also horrible if you do it the wrong way. And that's where there is this beautiful thing in Paul where it's like this reminder of whatever authority, it's just Jesus. It's like whatever authority you have, he could have had everything. I was just listening to a sermon this morning where just the astounding reality of him being tempted in the desert, that he could have had all the power ever, and he chose to wash feet. He said no to that and to continue to suffer, and then went and washed feet.
Could have had the kingdom without the cross.
100% could have had
the cross anyway.
And his acknowledgement, just like, that's just another kingdom. I don't want it. My kingdom's greater. And then he showed us what that kingdom looks like through service and through the ultimate magnanimous act of dying on the cross. And that's like such an example. And obviously Paul has that same value and that same calling on his life, where it's like the authority, whatever authority I have, it is to build you up, it is to love you well. And that is just a very healthy reminder for us.
Yeah, it is. I think that, like Anthony pointed out, we see it not used in that way often. And I feel like that is what maybe not gets lifted up. I don't mean that in a positive way, but that's where the spotlight is shown in our world a lot. Yeah. And so I think it would be really incredible if we as followers of Jesus lived in a way where our authority was only used to build others up. Yeah. And, as I was reading through this passage, and we've talked about this a little bit, and I think you guys are hitting on it so well, that I think that the audience had an image of what they wanted Paul to be. And he wasn't that. Like, he wasn't meeting those expectations in some ways. But I think what we know to be true is Paul was consistent in his words and actions, even though for them, maybe they were expecting different actions to accompany his words. And it led me to this thought that I think gets talked a lot about in some contexts of why is it so important for our actions to match our words? And I would just kick that to you guys. Michael, what would you say?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question, because first of all, the easy answer is like, well, because then your words matter when your actions match them. That's the easy, that's when you see somebody, like if I were to come up to you and be like, well, I'm trying to be better about making like mean jokes about myself, so I'm not going to say that. I'll just say it. If somebody like me who's a little out of shape were to come up to you and be like, let me tell you how to get healthy. Like, what? It's like, what are you talking about? Let me tell you about the best workout strategy. It's like, there's a level of when you don't have your actions to back up or the evidence of your actions, where it might have been different if you might not be in the best shape, but you're working towards you. So that's even different. But if you're somebody who's living this super stagnant life, and you're just like trying to tell people what like the best workout method when you haven't worked out in 10 years, it's like, that doesn't, like, I don't know that I'm going to trust that person. There is a power in having evidence of what you have done and then actions that back up what you're saying, where people just listen more and people care about it more. The weird tension of Christianity is that our actions will never 100% line up with our words. Yeah. And that's this like plague that I feel like a lot of people have felt. I felt it when I was younger and going into ministry for sure. And I still feel it at times where, how am I supposed to preach about this when I know that it's something that I'm struggling with on a daily basis, or it's something that I still have to process through, and I know that I'm still going to fall in, and it's like, man, it's the age old, like if you waited to preach about it until you were good at it, until you mastered it, you just probably would never preach about anything, and you never like talk about anything. So there's that tension of like, no, you want your actions to back it up because it adds weight, it adds character, and it gives people the confidence that you are living this out. But at the same time, there has to be a humility And you have to also recognize that, like, I could try forever and I still have to have grace for myself and others, because none of us will get it right. And that is a really important kind of tension to manage, not one to solve.
Yeah, you made me think of the old saying, right? Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, for real, yeah.
Like I think,
That's my life with my kids. It's like
100%. Yeah, I think every parent feels that
sure,
tension.
yeah.
That's certainly one that we have to live with.
Yeah, in my house, the word stupid is a swear word. Like, my kids literally call it the S word, and every time they say that, I'm like, oh, that's not what that means.
Yeah.
I don't say it. People are going to think you're saying something else.
Yeah.
But I'll obviously say, oh, it's stupid. And every time my 4-year-old is like, Dad,
Wide-eyed.
don't say that. I'm like, well, yeah, I shouldn't. I'm sorry.
Isn't that the worst when you get rebuked by your own children?
Yeah, for sure.
You're like, well, I must be doing a good job teaching them, but I must not be doing a great job living
now
it
I gotta
out.
actually do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's the word integrity comes to mind. I think you hit on the word trust. Like there's a level of, this is a person of integrity. This is a person I can trust because they do what they say. There's not a discrepancy between the two. I think even from a practical side of things, again, to use age-old expressions like talk is cheap, in that it's easy to talk about something. It's easy to say something. It's much harder to live it out, because when you live it out, usually there's sacrifices involved. There's really no real sacrifice to saying something. I believe this, or I think this. Great. When you actually live that out, that's even from a Christian perspective, the attractiveness of it. Like it's one thing to say, I care about the people that society doesn't care about. God cares about the people society doesn't care about. It's something else to actually live like that is true, right? 100%. To treat people with a special regard of dignity and compassion, and to lift them up, as we were talking about. So I think, in a very real way, again, to use biblical teaching like James chapter 2, and he gives a great example of this, right? Where he says to the person who has needs, like if you say go and be warmed and filled, but don't give them the needs for the body, what good is that? Like there's a practical element of like, okay, you gave them a blessing, so to speak, but you didn't actually help them. So I think there's even just a very functional, practical component of things don't change in the world simply because you say something. Now, that's not to say what you say can't impact a person if you're proclaiming truth or giving them some sort of wisdom. Yeah. But I think especially when we're talking about convictions, saying these things matter, we have to live then like they matter. Man,
I saw in a documentary when I was younger. It was actually crazy. It was like 2008. Hillsong United released a movie about Hillsong United, and I was in my church worship team, and I was stoked. I was the biggest fan. Like, United We Stand, like, changed my life. Like, this is the best. This album is incredible. It still holds up. It's a great album. Go listen to it. Super good. But we all went to the movie. It ironically debuted on a Wednesday. I think their hope is that youth groups would go see it. But we asked our youth pastor, I'm like, can you guys do CD worship tonight so we can go to this movie? And he was like, yep, you guys can go. So it was like a high school worship team. We went to watch it. And it was the worst bait and switch I've ever experienced. Where it was like the movie started, and it was literally Joel Houston, the guy who started the band, goes, I'll bet, he in his Australian accent, I'll bet you thought. I'm not Mackie, I can't do a good Australian accent, but I bet you thought this movie was about Hillsong United. It's not. And immediately I was like, what a waste of time. But he's like, it's about their travels and the missions work and things that they've seen basically going to developing nations and developing countries at the time. And it was a beautiful doc. I'm glad I saw it. I've watched it multiple times since. It was really beautiful. But there's something that someone said in that documentary that has like stuck with me. I'm not going to say haunted. That's probably the wrong word to use, but that's really stuck with me. It was this person who they had a translator for him, but he said, and he was an older man, he goes, you guys come, you Christians come, and you give us blankets, and you give the kids candy. He goes, but the candy rots the kids' teeth, and the blankets rot as well. And it's like, what have you done? And I remember hearing that of like, oh, man. And that's like, a cheap term is called slacktivism. This idea where you feel like you've done much. You feel like, oh, well, I stood on the street corner and I said that God loves, or God hates you, even if you feel like whatever God hates you, God loves you, whatever your message is, you feel like I did my work today, or I gave, $1 to somebody, or I did this. Where the reality is exactly what Pastor Anthony said. Like, there is a power and a humility of like, no, like actually doing what Jesus did, which boots on the ground, living in people's life and being, invested in them. And that is, where talk is cheap, that's expensive. The actual action to do those things costs time and energy and effort, and it's challenging, but it's worthwhile, and it does. That's where a lot of that authority comes from too, because people can see it in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in thinking about confidence and authority in our world today, so much confidence and authority that people have come from positions they have, come from titles, come from how much money they make. right? And we could go on and on. The accomplishments, the awards on their walls, whatever it is. And I think what's beautiful and where I feel like our conversation has gone is that true confidence and true authority comes from Christ alone. And I think that we just live in such a world that easily distracts us from that simple and complex. It's simple and complex truth, and tells us we need to buy into all of these other things.
Yeah, well said.
For you guys in verses 7 through 11, is there anything else you want to hit on before we close out this chapter?
No, I think that was great.
I think it's great, yeah.
All right, let's go to verse 12. It says this. Oh, don't worry. We wouldn't dare say that we are as wonderful as these other men who tell you how important they are. It's hard to not laugh in this passage.
The sarcasm.
But they are only comparing themselves with each other, using themselves as the standard of measurement. How ignorant.
My man, tell him.
We will not boast about things done outside our area of authority. We will boast only about what has happened within the boundaries of the work God has given us, which includes our working with you. We are not reaching beyond these boundaries when we claim authority over you as if we had never visited you. For we were the first to travel all the way to Corinth with the good news of Christ. Nor do we boast and claim credit for the work someone else has done. Instead, we hope that your faith will grow so that the boundaries of our work among you will be extended. Then we will be able to go and preach the good news in other places far beyond you where no one else is working. Then there will be no question of our boasting about work done in someone else's territory. As the scriptures say, if you want to boast, boast only about the Lord. When people commend themselves, it doesn't count for much. The important thing is for the Lord to commend them. I really feel like this section, there's a lot packed in here. But Anthony, what is the distinction Paul is making between these other men in verse 12 and himself?
Well, I think verse 18 kind of summarizes it, right? They're people that are commending themselves, right? And the truth is, nobody likes a person who's always boasting about themselves. Like that's not an attractive
nobody wants to invite
feature.
that person to the party.
And we've all maybe encountered those people who are like trying to boast under the radar, but it's still more obvious than they think.
Even
and
worse.
it's like, man, like you could just tell. But nobody wants to be around those people. Now, again, I think going back to the context, maybe there was an attractiveness in a more Greek, culture where, humility was not seen as a virtue, and so they're boasting and stuff. But it doesn't change the reality that is not how God has called his people to operate. And again, we're talking about the context of the church here in Corinth. So these apostles have commended themselves. They've essentially taken authority for themselves that has not been given to them, unlike Paul, right? Jesus, again, has commissioned Paul. So even Paul, was not looking for it. So even think about that. You have these individuals who have taken authority for themselves. They're using it in self-serving ways. They're not necessarily teaching accurate things. They're commending themselves, boasting about themselves, where Paul is walking not with arrogance, but humility, yet he's the one that's been actually called and commissioned by Christ. He uses his authority not for self-serving purposes, but to serve the people. So there's just a massive contrast here between him and the way that these individuals are operating. And again, as we've been talking this entire time, Paul is very clearly modeling what Jesus did.
Yeah, and I think Paul's talking about a specific example between two parties and separating himself and explaining that difference with humility and with context as well. But I think the stakes to the logic of this are even greater than this one example. This is the parable of Jesus talking about the tax collector and the Pharisee, where they both go up. They both go up for prayer, and it starts with the Pharisee who's like, "God, thank you that I'm great." It's pretty much pretty much the vibe. That, thank you that I'm awesome. Thank you that I tithe. That I do all these holy things. I pray, that I know the scriptures. And then he looks over at the tax collector, like, "Thank you that I'm better than him.
I'm not like this guy.
Thank you that I'm not like him." And it just like the back half of that parable just wrecks me every time I think about it. Where Jesus describes this tax collector as this person who's like knelt at the side of the road, banging on his chest, begging God for mercy. And it's like, and Jesus just has this such wild question of who do you think inherits the kingdom of heaven in this situation? And every time it's not the person who's standing on their own ego and their own pride and things that they've done in their resume. It's also worth saying that great people very rarely have to say they're great. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're doing the right thing, when you accomplish things when you have much accomplishment, that's not a bad thing. But usually people who are genuinely great about it, and especially have a humility about them, don't need to describe or to tell you about it. They just allow that they are just themselves, and the people who witness it are the people who witness it, and at times can be edified and encouraged by it. You don't need to grandstand. You don't need to be the Pharisee, just like trying to paint this context of your own righteousness. What really gives us value and what really gives us access to the kingdom of heaven is the humble posture of I am a bondservant of Christ. I am made whole in him, and that's the accomplishment that I have. Separately, that tax collector could be extremely wealthy and could have much money and much personal accolades.
Sure.
We don't know. It's a parable anyways. It's not like, but you know what I mean? Like it's separate. The real thing that gives you the inheritance of the kingdom of heaven is the ability to say, like, God, I need you. And that is where, again, going back to the authority that Paul has and what separates him from the men that he's describing, these other men that he's talking about in verse 12. That's that difference, where he doesn't need to grandstand because he has the Lord. He has that anointing on his life. He knows that his salvation is secure, and that to me is where a lot of that power comes from. So for him, he's just, explaining the context of why his word should have weight, which is very true. I'm not trying to say that that's less than. There's just also a deeper meaning there. Where it's like this is as important as what Jesus said is your salvation, of understanding that will not get you into heaven. That will not bring you into His presence for eternity. But the humble posture of needing the Lord, that's where that comes from.
Yeah, Anthony, what is the in simplest terms, what is the standard that these other men are using, and why does Paul call it out as ignorant?
Well, he says it in verse 12, right? They're comparing themselves with each other, using themselves as the standard of measurement. Yeah. So, you think about that. If you are the standard of measurement, how can anyone find any fault in what you're doing, right? If I am the picture of perfection of what an apostle should look like, well, number one, you can't come against me. But number two, anyone that doesn't operate or think or talk like me then must be inferior. So you even think about this in terms of them trying to belittle Paul. They're commending themselves, saying, this is how, they're demonstrating how they're operating. Clearly they have some, credibility to the people there in the church, right? That's what's interesting about this entire thing. They've clearly gathered a following. They've been allowed into the church. They've been allowed some position of authority. But you think about what they're doing now is they're actually belittling Paul because Paul doesn't operate the way that they operate. And again, I think this is so important because Paul is going back to, look, I'm operating the way that Christ intended, right? Mm-hmm. This is ultimately the church that belongs to Jesus. Yeah. I'm an apostle sent by Jesus, demonstrating things in the way that Jesus demonstrating, the way that Jesus carried himself. So everything that Paul is doing, he is modeling after Christ, as we've talked about several times through this podcast. Where they're pulling out new standards. And again, I think to the context, maybe some of them pagan Greek standards of what an authority figure should look like, how they should operate, boasting in themselves, not in the Lord, throwing their weight around, obviously having self-serving purposes. So again, Paul is saying, this is ridiculous that they are using themselves as the standard when they themselves were not even given any authority, right? They weren't given any authority.
Yeah, I think it's also worth saying too, that to me is one of the greatest red flags that you're living in an echo chamber in your life. So these men, the reason why they feel like they're holy is because they're hanging out with people who do the same things. They're marking their works against each other and in their own community, which the people in leadership act this way. So that's what that looks like. And it's in context to these people. Then all of a sudden it takes someone like Paul, who is coming in with a different value set and a different humility to teach them oh no, this is not even the right way at all. That is the fear of living in an echo chamber. If you're not exposed to somebody, I had a guy tell me once, if you're ever the smartest person in the room, get out. If you ever feel like there's, and unless, the caveat, unless it's ministry, even that it's hard to qualify yourself as the smartest person, but there's something to be said for communicating to everybody, you love them and you care about them. But if you're ever in a place where that's your continual circle in life, where there's no one around you teaching you things, where they all have the same 10 ideas as you, and there's no one. Everyone should have people in their life that's actively making them think about it, think about things differently. So even in this very small context, literally today in this podcast, I've always viewed that as Paul's probably bad at public communication, you're great at writing. That's just kind of my, without a deep dive, that's always kind of been my rough assumption. The moment Anthony was I think that it could actually be more like this about their standard. I'm oh man, does that make sense? That's because you need to surround yourself with people who are giving you a different bar to hit and different information and different. I had another person tell me that you also have a responsibility to find the smart people in the room and learn from them. That's you have a steward over your mind well. When all the people in your life, you are marking your holiness against them and you feel like you're in a good place, you have to expose yourself to new people, new thoughts, even if they're bad ones, to even show you, I don't want to be like that. You know what I mean? You have to like understand context. Because the moment that you are in your own micro set of a community, you see it on Facebook all the time, where people have their small little, Facebook community. They'll make a crazy post, and all of their 30 people who think a similar thing like it, and it's like, and they're like, we did it. Like we all know that this is right.
They're affirmed in their personal convictions because the people that are around them think exactly the way that they do.
Yeah, 100%.
So there's no real accountability.
And there's no real growth either. Yeah. And that to me is so sad. I really believe that in my life, any knowledge that I have, it's not because I'm especially organically intelligent or smart. It's because I've just like ripped off a lot of smart people, and you listen. You have to actively listen and be humble, and that's that when you hear about these men and why that standard is so poor. It's like, because it's just, if that's your standard, you're stuck to what's around you, and that is a dangerous place to be in.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. But I also think it is human nature to look around and kind of compare ourselves to one another. Yeah. So, Michael, what would you say the standard should be? If it's not other people, if that's not the right measurement, what is our standard?
Yeah, I'll kind of talk out of both sides of my mouth and say that it can be other people if you feel like God has put people into your life that can inspire you and can like expose you. But the point of that being, if they are exposing you to God. Like that would be the point of it's not just like avoid other people and only you can use other people as to compare yourself to in a standard of measurement. I had a pastor tell me once when I was young, I say like I had at the time I still I have just a bad habit where I use words like too quick, where I'll just say something kind of crazy and out of pocket and be like, okay, not the right time. What do read the room, dude. And I had a pastor who loved me enough who just corrected me all the time, where he would just tell me like the gnarliest feedback, but it was really important at that season of my life. And I remember he told me once, like, he was just like so sick of me saying boneheaded things. He's like, hey, just before you say anything for like 6 months, like just before you talk, think about 5 people, like men and women of God that you respect, and just ask yourself the simple question, would they say that? And if they wouldn't, think about it. It's not an absolute. It doesn't mean that you must not say it, but it's just a good thing to look at. Yeah. But really the even point of that practice is because those godly men and women they are representing Christ. Like the standard that Paul wants us to compare ourselves to is Jesus. That is the standard. So it's okay if you have people in your life that help point you to that. It's okay if you have people that encourage you to be more like that. It's okay if you're surrounded by people that remind you, I don't want to be like that. I would rather be more, in the image of Jesus. But that is the standard. I mean, even think about humans were made as image bearers, as like icons of God, as these like carriers of God's, of His image. It's like, man, that's the standard. Is I want to be more like that. And I know I'm going to fall in that process, but there can be no other standard because nothing else is as concrete as how we and why we were made. Yeah. Like the closer I can get to how God designed us, and we can learn about that by reading the Bible, by being led by the Spirit, by submitting to those things, and like I said, by looking at the godly men and women around you. That is the standard because all those things point to God and His design for us.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, I would say it's so important for us to continuously reassess, the standard that we are. Like, we do so many things and we don't actually ever stop and question, why do I think this way? Why do I talk this way? Why am I pursuing this thing? So I think there's this constant need for reassessment. Almost what you said, or your pastor said to you with these, 5 godly men or women. It's like, is this what Scripture teaches? Is this the way of Jesus? Yeah. Or has something else kind of snuck in here where I'm starting to believe things that are actually not in step with the gospel? Yeah.
And how often do you see that in ministry where, I don't want to talk about like super controversial stuff, but you see even in the Christian culture of like Western Christianity right now, where other philosophies and other political principles, or fill in the blank with anything, philosophical principles, sneak their way, have crept into the faith, and where it's like all of a sudden that now becomes, well, that's a part of
what it means to be Christian.
That's a part of being a Christian, where it's like, well, no, that's the standard for like an American Christian right now, that I was born in the 90s and grew up in this time, so that is my perspective.
Absolutely.
Right? But the reality is the only real standard is how God designed it. And like I said, and luckily God's like, talk about being magnanimous. Like He gave us, first of all, Jesus to save us, but He also gave us the Bible, and these guidelines to try to get closer to that rather than farther. But that is, it is really tricky when you're looking sideways rather than looking like, what does God have for me?
Yep.
Yeah, that's good. I see Paul in, again, how I read this passage, I kind of see his perspective start to shift a little bit, and hopefully we'll get to why here in a sec, but the question I would pose to you, Anthony, is I feel like Paul lays out a clear reason why he wants their faith to grow, but what do you see in this passage of why Paul wants their faith to grow?
I mean, I would say number one, I think you start with his motivation, which is one of love, right? He's not, again, using his authority for self-serving purposes. He genuinely cares about them. So I would say, like, what does that mean when we say Paul loves them? Well, he wants them to become more like Jesus. I know that sounds like a very simple answer, but I think you even have to peel back the layers of like, what is the goal of the church? Like, what is the command and the mission of the church? If it is to make disciples, okay, well, what does that mean? Disciple, it literally means to become, right, the posture of a learner, someone who's an apprentice of Jesus. So Paul, this is why he's so concerned. I mean, you see him write about it all the time in other letters. He's so concerned about false teachers because he knows there's this constant threat of the people that he loves and cares for. He wants to see Christ formed in them, but there's constant threats of believing false teachings and ideas and false leaders who have crept in and are doing things out of false motives. And so he's constantly trying to, I think about it as kind of like if you go bowling back in the day when you're a kid and you had the bumper lanes, like that is what he's trying to do. He's trying to keep them from literally going off the rails with all of these other things that are happening in the church. So yeah, his heart for them, and it's even just as this series that we're doing, like we believe that the heart of human flourishing comes when we walk according to God's design, right? So even this idea of him wanting them to become more like Jesus, the best that he could hope for them is that, right? Because human flourishing comes when we operate according to God's design, because we are image bearers. We were created by God. We were created for God. So his heart is, he wants them to be in line with that, and he's concerned that there's anything that's going to pull them away from that. He's not afraid to speak against that, particularly false teachers in many different contexts, including this one.
Michael, would you add anything?
I mean, the thing that popped in my head are you familiar with at all Christian hedonism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's like this principle of I think it's that the author that I most associate that with is John Piper. Although I can't say confidently that he is the founder of it. He probably is, but the concept of Christian hedonism is like, when I think of hedonism, I think about, we were talking about reality shows. I think about Jersey Shore. It's hedonistic. It's like people literally going off of impulse and
pursuing
what feels
pleasure
good.
At all costs.
Yep, but moment by moment, what feels best. And John Piper, in quite a few of his books, just had this really just beautiful explanation of God, where it's like, no, believe it or not, he also wants hedonism from us. It's not this ugly word. The conviction is that he believes that true hedonism, true pleasure, comes from acting in the way that God designed you to act. And that's like, that would be where you want that faith to grow, and where you want that stuff to permeate in people's lives, because I'm just convicted that the more we operate in God's design, does not mean your life is necessarily going to get easier. It doesn't mean that the surrounding situations will change. I'm pretty vehemently against the prosperity gospel in that sense, that everything has a cause and effect. I've seen too much in life, and you also have too much of a global context. There's some people that they're born and they're really hungry, and that's all they ever do, and then they pass away soon after. So it's not this idea of, if I'm just faithful enough, like things will be good. Like Paul, and pretty much all of these authors were, they died in spectacular ways from really cruel people. So it's not about like good things will happen if you do the right stuff. But I do believe that your quality of life increases with your own personal, spiritual, emotional health, mental health fulfillment when we are operating the way that God designs us to operate. I do believe at times that also does come with like tangible blessing. I'm not saying that does not happen. But that Christian hedonism principle, that's where I want anyone's faith to grow. Because I'm like, I promise it's going to make your life better in one way or another.
And I think maybe this is what you were getting at too. I think the overflow of this, when this happens in our lives, is the impact, right? Like the outward impact.
So good.
When God does something in us, he does it to do something through us. And I think that overflow is what he references here in verse 15. So it is for their sake. I believe wholeheartedly Paul cares about them. He cares about what's happening in their lives. He wants them to grow. He wants them to experience the best life that Christ has for them. Again, not defining how the world views the best life, but also so that as that happens, the impact of the gospel is going to expand and grow, right? Like the reality is, until we allow God to change and mold and shape our lives, there's zero chance that we're going to be able to make an impact for the kingdom if we're not allowing that to happen first.
Yeah, even Paul's context. Paul was so convinced that Jesus was coming back in his lifetime.
Sure.
Paul, like even most of his writings, you feel this urgency. Like when he talks about sexuality, he's like, don't even get married if you can hack it. Like don't just be celibate and go do the mission, because he had this like urgency of like Jesus is coming back. We got to do the work now. So even that, his idea, and then he's like, and if you can't get married, but even that, like go, but still so mission minded. That urgency is where it's like, it's not exactly as we're talking about. It's not just about your own quality of life. That's also evangelism. Like that's attractive to people when you can see that kind of health in people's life.
Yeah, that's good. And Anthony, I do think for me, what I saw is, yes, Paul cares about these people. He wants them to be deeper and deeper followers of Jesus and know truth. But it is so that they and himself can go on and share the good news with people who haven't heard it yet.
Absolutely.
And I think we have to remember that our faith is not just about us. Like, it's not so individualistic. We need our faith to grow. God wants our faith to grow because it is the overflow. It is how he reaches the lost people, his lost people. To wrap up our conversation, I mean, there's a lot of other things we could go into, but what is it that Paul is pointing us to that we should boast in, and how do we do that, Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure here, if I remember, I didn't look this up. I think that's a quote from Jeremiah 9 or 10, where he actually talks like, let the wise man not boast in his wisdom, let not the rich man boast in his riches, but, let the one boast that he knows me and he knows the Lord. Like this idea of, we can boast in a lot of things, and people do boast in a lot of things, but our boast is ultimately in Christ and Christ alone. And that's really the theme that we keep seeing throughout this entire chapter and really all of Paul's letters. It's ultimately Christ is the foundation. The boast is realizing for him, I mean, from a practical standpoint, again, his authority, his confidence, it comes from Jesus. So why would you boast in anything other than Jesus? The power that he is demonstrating in his ministry. I mean, you read the book of Acts, Paul is doing incredible things. Yeah. How is he doing this? Is he doing it by his own strength or ability? No. And Paul was a smart guy. I mean, read Philippians 3. He gives all of his accolades and says, I count them as garbage if I could just know Christ. So there, for him, there is no amount of worldly accolades or power that even compares to knowing Jesus and knowing the power of Jesus. So for him, that was a very, very much a lived experience, a lived reality. And I would say the same is true for us, that our confidence, yes, we can have gifts and abilities. All of us do. God has blessed us, but realizing the source. I think that's what it comes down to, realizing the source of all these things and even the objective or the goal. What is the goal? Like, not only is the source God's power, it's the Spirit of God who works in us and through us, but the goal is not about us. The goal is not all about our platform or our success. It's going back to what you just said. It's about the mission of God, what God is doing in the world, that we get to be a part of something. God is so gracious in that he allows us, not only allows us, but that the church literally is his plan A, that God has ordained that my people are the way that I'm going to spread the kingdom on earth. But again, all of that through and through, it's God's power, it's his mission, it's all about him. So anytime we try to reduce that, we immediately, we get off track on what we really should be focused on.
Yeah, that's also good. There's just one thing that's all great, but I would even double down on, because I think it's easy to miss at times, that a lot of times we'll compare the junk in our own life, just exactly like tax collector and Pharisee. We'll compare it and feel good about it. Like that's worthy of boast. Like, look at all the cool stuff that I've done. It's super important to recognize that it's not just about acknowledging the fact that you're broken, to let that be enough for you to only boast in the Lord. Because that's the easy. Well, I know I'm a bad person, so I shouldn't boast in that, so I'll boast in the Lord. It's also exactly what Paul said. No, even the good stuff, even the good stuff, even the accolades, even all the great things that Paul is, like, it is garbage next to what God is, and being in a relationship with him is the ultimate. And so I would just double down on that. Of be mindful, like, don't allow yourself into the trap of, because I'm so bad, because you will go through seasons like, I actually feel like I'm doing pretty good right now. So maybe I can boast to myself. Even then, even the greatness that you might have is counted as nothing compared to the work of the cross and the salvation work it gives us.
Yeah, that's great. Anthony and Michael, thank you guys so much for having this conversation today. Thank you guys for listening in and joining us. We hope that it was a blessing in your life. And if it was, we hope that you would share this, rate this, tell other people about this conversation. And if you're able, we would love for you to join us on Sunday mornings at 9 and 11 a.m. And we hope to see you back next week for our next conversation about 2 Corinthians.